The ice-laden waters of the Delaware River crashed against the wooden hull of the Durham boat as General George Washington steadied himself against the gunwale, his piercing blue eyes scanning the treacherous crossing ahead. It was the night of December 25th, 1776, and the fate of the American Revolution hung in the balance like morning frost on a spider's web. The Continental Army, reduced to fewer than 2,400 men, was about to embark on what many would later call the most audacious military gamble in American history. Washington's weathered hands gripped the boat's edge as chunks of ice, the size of dinner plates, scraped against the vessel's sides. The crossing had begun at 6 in the evening. But the brutal winter storm had turned what should have been a 3-hour operation into a 9-hour nightmare of frozen oars and numb fingers. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead fishermen, their faces, carved by years of Atlantic gales, worked with methodical precision as they navigated the treacherous waters. These were men who had spent their lives battling the sea, and now they would help battle for freedom itself. Behind Washington in the cramped boat, his officers huddled against the biting wind that cut through their threadbare uniforms like sabers. Major General Nathaniel Greene pulled his woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders, his Rhode Island constitution ill-prepared for this Pennsylvania winter. Beside him, Colonel Alexander Hamilton, barely 21 years old, but already displaying the sharp intellect that would one day reshape a nation's economy, calculated ammunition supplies and troop positions in his head. The young West Indian had volunteered for this desperate mission, understanding that failure would likely mean the gallows for them all. The men in the boats behind them represented the last hope of a dying cause. Many were shoeless, their feet wrapped in bloodied rags that left crimson trails in the snow. Their enlistments would expire at midnight on December 31st, and few showed inclination to re-enlist. The recent defeats at Fort Washington and Fort Lee had shattered morale, Thomas Paine's words from the crisis. These are the times that try men's souls seemed prophetic rather than inspiring. Yet here they were, crossing an ice-choked river in a blizzard, following a Virginia planter who had never won a major battle. As Washington's boat finally scraped against the Pennsylvania shore, he could see the exhaustion etched in every soldier's face, illuminated by flickering torches. Private John Greenwood, a 16-year-old fifer from Massachusetts, later recalled how the general's presence seemed to radiate determination even in their darkest hour. Washington stepped onto the muddy bank and immediately began organizing his forces, his voice carrying clearly over the howling wind as he issued orders with the calm authority that had made him the unanimous choice to lead the Continental Army. The plan was deceptively simple, yet incredibly dangerous. They would march 9 miles through the storm to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn, then continue to Princeton to strike the British before they could react. It was the kind of bold stroke that could either save the Revolution or end it in catastrophe. Colonel Henry Knox, the former Boston bookseller whose cannons had forced the British from Boston, supervised the landing of his artillery pieces, each one crucial to the success of their desperate gamble. As the last boat reached shore and the Continental Army began its silent march through the frozen New Jersey countryside, Washington knew they had crossed more than just a river. They had crossed from despair into hope, from retreat into attack. The Battle of Princeton, still days away, would prove whether this crossing marked the beginning of American independence or merely delayed its inevitable end. The church bells of Trenton had fallen silent hours before Colonel Johann Gottlau Brawl's Hessian regiment settled into their Christmas evening festivities. Inside the stone barracks, German mercenaries celebrated with schnapps and cards, their blue uniforms hanging loosely after months of comfortable garrison duty. Raoul himself, a career soldier who had served with distinction in European campaigns, dismissed reports of American activity across the Delaware as the desperate posturing of a broken army. The Hessian colonel's confidence would prove to be as fatal. Miscalculation. Washington's army had endured an 8-hour march through the blizzard, their bare feet leaving bloody prints in snow that reached their ankles. The storm that had made their river crossing so treacherous now provided perfect cover for their approach to Trenton. Lieutenant James Monroe, future President of the United States, marched alongside Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, both men understanding that this night would either secure their place in history or their appointment with the executioner's block. At precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26th, the Continental Army struck Trenton like lightning splitting an oak tree. The attack came from two directions simultaneously, catching the Hessians completely unprepared. Colonel Knox's artillery, positioned at the head of King Street and Queen Street, began a devastating bombardment that shattered windows and sent Hessian soldiers scrambling for weapons they had carelessly set aside. The thunderous roar of cannon fire echoed off the buildings like the voice of revolution itself. Raoul, wakened by the chaos, rushed from his quarters, still buttoning his uniform. The professional soldier in him immediately recognized the tactical brilliance of the assault, but it was too late to mount an effective defense. His men, many still suffering from their Christmas celebrations, stumbled through the streets seeking cover as American musket balls whistled past their ears. The Hessians' famed discipline crumbled under the surprise attack, and what should have been an orderly retreat became a panicked rout. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, but its psychological impact would resonate for generations. Forces captured nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers, while suffering only 4 wounded Americans, 2 of whom were Monroe and William Washington. Both struck during the assault on enemy artillery positions. More importantly, the victory provided the Continental Army with desperately needed supplies: muskets, ammunition, horses, and 6 brass cannons that would prove crucial in future engagements. As reported in the Pennsylvania Evening Post of January 2nd, 1777, the victory at Trenton has given such spirits to our people that many who before hardly dared peep out still hold their heads high. The newspaper's account captured the transformation that had occurred not just in the army, but in the broader American population, who had watched their cause seemingly crumble throughout the autumn of 1776. But Washington understood that one victory, however spectacular, would not win a war. The British would respond swiftly and decisively to this humiliation. General William Howe, commanding British forces from his comfortable headquarters in New York, would undoubtedly dispatch overwhelming force to crush this renewed American resistance. The Continental Army had perhaps days, maybe only hours, before facing retaliation that could erase their Trenton triumph and end the Revolution permanently. As his men celebrated their first significant victory in months, Washington was already planning their next move. Princeton lay just 12 miles northeast, garrisoned by British regulars who would soon learn of Trenton's fall. The element of surprise was already evaporating like morning mist, and the general knew that hesitation now would prove fatal. The crossing of the Delaware had been audacious, Trenton had been brilliant, but Princeton would determine whether American independence remained possible or became merely a beautiful dream. Crushed by British bayonets, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Washington had learned about warfare, leadership, and the delicate art of transforming citizen soldiers into an army capable of defeating the world's most powerful military force. The dawn of January 2nd, 1777, broke gray and bitter over the frost-covered fields between Trenton and Princeton. General Washington sat astride his white charger, studying the frozen landscape through his spyglass, while his breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. Intelligence reports from local patriots indicated that Colonel Charles Mawhood commanded approximately 1,200 British regulars in Princeton, supported by artillery and positioned in strong defensive works around the town. The American force, swollen by New Jersey militia, eager to join after the Trenton victory, now numbered nearly 5,000 men. But Washington knew that numbers alone would not guarantee success against seasoned British troops. The plan Washington devised demonstrated the strategic thinking that would eventually earn him comparison to history's greatest military commanders. Rather than assault Princeton directly, he would divide his force into 2 columns. General Hugh Mercer, the Scottish-born physician turned soldier, would lead 1,500 men along the back roads toward the Stony Brook Bridge, while Washington himself would command the main body in a frontal approach designed to draw British attention. It was a complex maneuver requiring precise timing and coordination, exactly the kind of sophisticated operation that Conventional wisdom claimed militia forces could never execute. As the Continental Army began its march in the pre-dawn darkness, the soldiers' spirits remained high despite their physical exhaustion. Private Joseph White of Massachusetts later wrote to his wife that the general rides among us like a father among his sons, speaking words of encouragement that warm our hearts more than any fire could warm our frozen hands. Washington's presence had become almost mystical to his men. They had seen him cross an ice-choked river, defeat professional soldiers, and transform their ragtag force into something resembling a real army. The British, meanwhile, had not remained idle since learning of Trenton's fall. Colonel Mahood, a veteran of campaigns in the Caribbean and Europe, had immediately begun preparations to evacuate Princeton and consolidate forces with General Cornwallis, who was advancing from New York with overwhelming numbers. Mahood's plan was sound: avoid decisive engagement until British numerical superiority could be brought to bear. However, the colonel had underestimated both the speed of Washington's advance and the American general's willingness to risk everything. On a single bold stroke, at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, advance elements of Mercer's column encountered British foragers near the William Clark Farm, about 2 miles southwest of Princeton. The initial exchange of musket fire seemed routine. Small skirmishes had become commonplace as both armies maneuvered for advantage. But this engagement would rapidly escalate into something far more significant. Captain John Fleming of the 3rd Virginia Regiment later described the moment when they realized they had stumbled into the enemy's main force. The morning mist lifted like a theater curtain, revealing red coats in formation where we expected to find empty fields. Mahood, alerted by the gunfire, made a decision that would alter the course of American history. Instead of continuing his planned withdrawal, the British colonel chose to attack what he assumed was merely an American scouting party. His 17th Light Infantry and 55th Regiment of Foot, supported by artillery, advanced rapidly toward the sound of firing. It was exactly the aggressive response Washington had hoped to provoke, but the American general was still miles away with his main force, leaving Mercer's column dangerously exposed. The stage was now set for a collision that would test every lesson learned. During 18 months of revolution, British professional soldiers, trained in European warfare and confident in their superiority, would face American citizen soldiers fighting for their homes and families. The morning air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder as both forces prepared for combat that would determine not just the outcome of a single battle, but potentially the survival of American independence. In Princeton's streets, civilians barricaded themselves in cellars and attics, knowing that their town was about to become the focal point of forces that would reshape the world. The Battle of Princeton was about to begin, and with it, America's true test as a nation worthy of freedom. General Hugh Mercer's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the scarlet line of British infantry emerge from the morning mist like specters of imperial power. The 17th Light Infantry advanced with the mechanical precision that had conquered an empire, their bayonets catching the pale January sunlight as they moved across the frozen fields near the Clark farmhouse. Mercer, a physician who had traded his medical bag for a sword in service of liberty, knew immediately that his column of 1,500 men faced annihilation unless they could hold their ground until Washington arrived with reinforcements. The opening volley from the British line shattered the morning stillness with thunder that rolled across the New Jersey countryside. Musket balls whistled through the bare branches of oak trees, sending bark flying like wooden shrapnel. Private Thomas McCarty of Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery watched in horror as the man beside him crumpled to the frozen earth, crimson spreading across the white snow like spilled wine. The reality of warfare, so different from the romantic notions that had inspired young men to enlist, struck the American line with devastating clarity. Colonel Charles Mahood, mounted on a brown mare and wearing the scarlet coat that marked him as an officer in His Majesty's service, directed his troops with the calm professionalism of a man who had fought from the Caribbean to the Canadian frontier. The British colonel had correctly assessed the American force as colonial militia stiffened by a few continental regulars. and he intended to demonstrate once again why British arms remained supreme throughout the world. His artillery, commanded by Lieutenant William Wickham, began a methodical bombardment that sent American soldiers diving for cover behind stone walls and farm buildings. Mercer attempted to rally his men by personal example, riding directly into the heaviest fire while shouting encouragement in his thick Scottish brogue. The general's courage inspired his troops, but courage alone could not overcome the professional discipline of British regulars, advancing with fixed bayonets. The 55th Regiment of Foot, veterans of campaigns against French forces in Canada, pressed forward relentlessly despite taking casualties from American musket fire. Their advance seemed as inevitable as sunrise. The crisis came when Mawhood ordered a bayonet charge that broke the American line like a hammer striking glass. Continental soldiers, many of whom had never faced cold steel in combat, began falling back toward the woods behind them. Mercer, still trying to prevent a complete rout, found himself surrounded by British soldiers who recognized his general's uniform and demanded his surrender. The Scottish-born physician drew his sword instead, choosing death over capitulation. In a moment that would later inspire countless tales of revolutionary heroism, as Mercer fell beneath British bayonets. Mortally wounded but still breathing, his scattered forces streamed toward the rear in what threatened to become a complete disaster. The British, sensing victory, pursued vigorously while their artillery continued pounding the fleeing Americans. For precious minutes, it appeared that the revolution might end in the frozen fields of New Jersey. Crushed beneath the boots of professional soldiers who had never doubted their superiority over colonial rebels, but Washington was coming. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of the main American force. Led by their commanding general, riding his white horse directly toward the sound of battle, Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding a battery of artillery, later wrote that Washington appeared like Mars himself descending from Olympus to decide the fate of mortals. The general's presence on the battlefield transformed panic into determination, retreat into advance, defeat into the possibility of victory. Washington's tactical genius revealed itself in how quickly he assessed the situation and responded. Instead of simply reinforcing Mercer's broken line, he positioned his artillery to enfilade the British advance while simultaneously ordering Colonel Daniel Hitchcock's Rhode Island Regiment to attack the enemy's exposed flank. The maneuver required split-second timing and absolute trust between commander and soldiers, exactly the kind of coordination that European observers insisted American forces could never achieve. The Battle of Princeton hung in the balance, as both armies committed their reserves in a contest that would determine whether American independence remained a possibility or became merely another failed colonial rebellion destined for the dustbin of history. The roar of cannon fire echoed across the Princeton battlefield as George Washington spurred his white charger directly between the opposing lines. Placing himself in the most dangerous position on the field where musket balls whistled past his head like angry hornets, Captain John Fitzgerald, his Irish-born aide-de-camp, later recalled, covering his eyes with his hands, certain that his beloved commander would be cut down in the crossfire between American and British forces. But Washington emerged from the chute, smoke unscathed, his presence galvanizing the Continental soldiers who had begun to waver under British pressure. The transformation was immediate and electric. Soldiers who had been retreating moments before suddenly steadied their lines and began advancing toward the enemy. Washington's voice carried clearly across the battlefield as he shouted, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." His words, delivered with absolute conviction while enemy bullets sang around him, convinced even the most inexperienced militiamen that victory was not only possible but inevitable. Under such leadership, Colonel Charles Mawhood, observing the American resurgence from his position near Nassau Hall, realized that his tactical situation had changed dramatically. What had begun as a successful attack against scattered rebel forces had become a pitched battle against a numerically superior enemy. Commanded by a general who displayed tactical acumen worthy of European battlefields, the British colonel's professional assessment told him that immediate withdrawal offered the only hope of preserving his command. But military pride and imperial arrogance demanded one final attempt to break American resolve. The decisive moment came when Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery, positioned on rising ground that commanded the battlefield, began a devastating artillery barrage that tore gaps in the British line like a scythe cutting wheat. Hamilton is barely 21 years old, but already demonstrating the precision that would later characterize his financial policies. Directed his guns with mathematical accuracy, each round found its mark among the densely packed British formations, creating carnage that even veteran soldiers found difficult to endure. Simultaneously, Washington ordered a general advance along the entire American line. The Continental Army moved forward with bayonets fixed, their battle cry of liberty or death rolling across the frozen fields like thunder from a gathering storm. The British, caught between Hamilton's artillery fire and the advancing American infantry, began to give ground for the first time in the engagement. Malhood's disciplined retreat quickly became something approaching panic as his soldiers realized they were outnumbered and outflanked, according to a detailed account published in the New York Journal on January 13, 17. The British resistance collapsed as suddenly as a house of cards struck by wind. The newspaper's correspondent, who had witnessed the battle from a nearby farmhouse, described how American forces swept across the field with an enthusiasm that could only spring from men fighting for their own hearths and homes. The report captured the transformation that had occurred within the Continental Army. From a demoralized rabble into a force capable of defeating the world's finest soldiers, the pursuit of the retreating British extended all the way to Kingston, where Malhood's survivors joined General Cornwallis's larger force, but the damage had been done. In less than 2 hours of fighting, Washington had inflicted approximately 400 casualties on British forces while suffering fewer than 50 himself. More importantly, he had captured Nassau Hall, and with it Princeton College, one of colonial America's most prestigious educational institutions and a symbol of intellectual independence that complemented the military victory. As American soldiers occupied Princeton's streets and began treating their wounded in makeshift hospitals established in local churches, Washington stood in Nassau Hall's main chamber, where the Continental Congress had briefly met years earlier. The building's walls, scarred by musket balls and cannon shot, seemed to echo with the voices of future generations who would study the principles of liberty within these halls. The general understood that this victory represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated that American forces could meet British regulars in open battle and emerge victorious. The psychological impact of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. News of the victory spread throughout the colonies, like wildfire, rekindling hope in hearts that had grown cold with despair. Militia units that had disbanded after earlier defeats began reforming, while foreign observers started taking seriously the possibility that these colonial rebels might actually achieve their independence. The smoke had barely cleared from the Princeton battlefield when riders began galloping along colonial roads, carrying news that would transform the American Revolution from a seemingly hopeless rebellion into a viable struggle for independence. Express messengers, their horses lathered with sweat despite the bitter January cold, carried dispatches to every major city from Boston to Charleston, each bearing the electrifying news that George Washington had defeated British regulars in open battle not once, but twice in the span of 10 days. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress received Washington's official report with a mixture of relief and amazement that bordered on disbelief. John Hancock, the Massachusetts merchant whose bold signature on the Declaration of Independence had made him the most wanted man in America, read the general's modest account of the Princeton victory to a chamber that erupted in spontaneous applause. Delegate John Adams of Massachusetts, never one for excessive optimism, wrote to his wife Abigail that the affairs of America begin to look more prosperous than they have done for many months past. The impact of Princeton resonated far beyond colonial shores, reaching the courts and coffee houses of European capitals, where diplomats and intellectuals had been watching the American experiment with skeptical interest. In Paris, the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, summoned American Representative Benjamin Franklin to discuss what had previously been unthinkable: formal French support for American independence. Franklin, the Philadelphia printer turned diplomat, understood immediately that Princeton had accomplished what months of negotiation could not. It had proven that American forces could defeat European professionals in conventional warfare. British reaction to the Princeton defeat revealed the depth of imperial concern about what had been dismissed as a minor colonial disturbance. General William Howe, commanding British forces from his New York headquarters, found himself explaining to London how a handful of colonial rebels had outmaneuvered and defeated seasoned British regulars in what should have been a routine suppression of rebellion. King George III, upon receiving House dispatches, reportedly declared that the American situation required immediate and overwhelming response to prevent other colonies from following the American example. The domestic impact of Princeton proved equally significant in transforming American public opinion about the war's prospects. Colonial newspapers, many of which had been predicting American defeat just weeks earlier, suddenly filled their pages with accounts of Washington's tactical brilliance and predictions of ultimate victory. The Pennsylvania Packet proclaimed that General Washington has shown himself to be not merely a patriot, but a military genius worthy of comparison with the greatest commanders of ancient and modern times. Perhaps most importantly, Princeton solved the Continental Army's critical recruitment crisis that had threatened to end the Revolution through simple attrition. Militiamen who had been reluctant to enlist for fear of joining a losing cause suddenly appeared at recruiting stations throughout the middle colonies. Washington's force, which had numbered fewer than 2,500 men during the Delaware crossing, swelled to over 8,000 within a month of the Princeton victory. These new recruits brought not only numbers, but renewed confidence. In ultimate American success, the psychological transformation extended to American civilian populations who had begun preparations for accommodation with British rule. Loyalist sentiment, which had been growing throughout the dark autumn of 1776, suddenly became not merely unpopular, but potentially dangerous in communities celebrating American military success. Patriots who had hidden their sentiments during the Revolution's darkest hours emerged to claim leadership roles in local governments and militia organizations. Foreign military observers, particularly those from France and Prussia who had been studying American military capabilities, began revising their assessments of colonial fighting potential. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French aristocrat seeking military glory, made his decision to join Washington's cause, largely based on reports of the Princeton campaign. His eventual participation would bring not only his personal courage, but crucial connections to French military and financial support. The strategic implications of Princeton extended throughout British North America, inspiring resistance movements in other colonies, while simultaneously forcing British commanders to reconsider their entire approach to suppressing rebellion. What had been conceived as a police action requiring limited force now clearly demanded the full attention and resources of the British Empire. The Battle of Princeton had transformed a colonial uprising into an international conflict with implications for the global balance of power. 6 months after the last musket shot echoed across Princeton's frozen fields, the true magnitude of Washington's victory began revealing itself through events that would reshape not merely America, but the entire Atlantic world. The battle that had lasted less than 2 hours on that bitter January morning in 1777, it initiated a chain reaction of consequences that would ultimately topple empires and establish new nations founded on principles of human liberty that seemed impossible before American bayonets proved them achievable. The immediate military consequences of Princeton became apparent when British forces abandoned most of New Jersey, retreating to defensive positions around New York City and leaving Patriot forces in control of territory they had held just weeks before the battle. General Cornwallis, the British commander who had been within hours of crushing Washington's army, found himself explaining to London how colonial rebels had outmaneuvered professional soldiers and seized the initiative in a war that British authorities had assumed was nearly won. The psychological impact of this reversal extended far beyond military considerations, demonstrating to European observers that American independence represented a realistic possibility rather than merely a romantic dream. The diplomatic revolution triggered by Princeton proved even more significant than its immediate military impact. Benjamin Franklin, working tirelessly in the salons and government offices of Paris, discovered that French attitudes toward American independence had transformed overnight following news of Washington's victories. The French court, which had been reluctant to risk war with Britain over what appeared to be a failing colonial rebellion, suddenly became eager to support what now seemed a viable challenge to British imperial dominance. The Treaty of Alliance signed between France and America in February 1778 traced its origins directly to the frozen battlefield where Washington had proven American military competence. Spanish and Dutch reactions to Princeton followed similar patterns, both nations beginning secret negotiations to support American independence as a means of weakening their British rival. The global conflict that would eventually emerge from these diplomatic shifts, involving battles from the Caribbean to India, began with the tactical decisions Washington made during those crucial hours in Princeton's streets. American independence, which had seemed impossible in December 1776, became increasingly inevitable as European powers committed their resources to supporting the American cause. The social transformation within America itself proved equally profound and long-lasting. Princeton had demonstrated that citizen soldiers fighting for their own liberty could defeat professional armies fighting for pay and imperial glory. This revelation strengthened democratic ideals throughout American society, encouraging ordinary citizens to believe they possessed both the right and the ability to govern themselves without hereditary rulers or aristocratic guidance. The battle became a foundational myth, proving that free men fighting for justice would ultimately triumph over tyranny regardless of apparent odds. The economic implications of Princeton extended throughout the Atlantic trading system as European merchants and financiers began taking American independence seriously as a commercial proposition. Dutch bankers, previously reluctant to loan money to what appeared to be a failing rebellion, suddenly became eager to finance American war efforts and future trade relationships. British merchants found their monopoly over North American commerce increasingly challenged as other European nations established trading relationships with American patriots, as documented in multiple contemporary accounts, including Charles Wilson Peel's detailed paintings of Revolutionary War scenes. Princeton represented the moment when American identity shifted from colonial dependency to national confidence. The battle proved that Americans could create military institutions capable of protecting their political independence, economic interests, and social values, without relying on European protection or guidance. This psychological transformation proved as important as any tactical victory in establishing the foundation for American nationhood. The international implications of Princeton continued reverberating through subsequent decades as other colonial populations throughout the world studied American success in achieving independence through military resistance. The French Revolution, Latin American independence movements, and numerous other struggles for national self-determination drew inspiration from the precedent established when Washington's army proved that determined citizen soldiers could defeat imperial forces and establish new nations. Based on principles of human equality and democratic governance, Princeton had answered the fundamental question posed by the American Revolution, whether ordinary people possessed the capacity for self-government that European political theory reserved for kings and aristocrats. Washington's victory demonstrated that free citizens could organize effective military forces, develop successful strategies, and execute complex operations that achieved decisive results against professional armies. This proof of democratic capability provided the foundation for everything that followed in American political development. The Battle of Princeton earned its place as a true turning point in United States history, not merely because it reversed American military fortunes during a critical moment, but because it established the precedent that free peoples could successfully resist imperial domination and create new nations based on principles of human liberty that would eventually transform the entire world.